It was already a bit of a stretch to see losing his majority, expelling more than 20 colleagues from his parliamentary party, and losing 3 Commons votes as part of an ingenious plan masterminded by his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. What was certainly not on Boris Johnson's schedule was the bombshell resignation of his own brother. What we do know is in the diary is a fresh attempt to trigger a general election early next week. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is right here. Gary, brother.
Oh, brother, indeed. This whole saga has been polluted with convoluted terms that people struggle to get round, but there's something about being dissed by your brother that has real cut-through. Ask the Miliband brothers, and I suspect this issue really hurt. On the substantial issue of this crisis today, Boris Johnson's attempts to get an early election, well, we seem to see the opposition parties, particularly Labour and the SNP, getting closer together in a strategy to try and put off that date. It doesn't look as though when Boris Johnson comes back on Monday, is expected to come back on Monday and try the same thing he failed to do yesterday and get an early election, doesn't look as though the opposition parties are going to help him out. If you were guessing at the moment, and the situation is very fluid, you'd think they are moving towards a position where they're going to say, actually, do you know what? There will be no early election until, you can't even call one until October the 21st, because that would be when the bill that's still going through the House of Lords at the moment, which tries to tie Boris Johnson's hands, if there isn't a deal, you have to negotiate, you have to ask for a delay, sign off on a delay to Brexit. It looks as though they're going to say until that is absolutely nailed down, we're not saying yes to an election. That seems to be where that is going. The other interesting thing today is that we've been hearing a lot about the election strategy that lies behind all of this, the thing that Boris Johnson wants to press the button on. And it sounds though what he wants to do in order to pull votes out of Labour's heartlands, traditional heartlands in the north, some of them in the West Midlands, in Wales and other places, what he wants to do is pivot from the Brexit issue, pocket the gains he's made there with people who support Brexit, but pivot over to talking about other issues and emphasising it's me or Jeremy Corbyn, his personal qualities as a leader. And you have to say, if that is the focus of an election campaign, whenever we get there, today wasn't a great day.
When you're planning to resign?
I haven't got any further comment to say, other than it's been an honour to be MP for Orpington and a minister under 3 governments. But it's time to move on, and I've got to get to work.
Wrecking the party, Mr. Johnson.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Joe Johnson rang his elder brother last night to say he was quitting his government. He just couldn't stomach what the Prime Minister was doing. He spared his brother a full public attack, but tweeted, in recent weeks, I've been torn between family loyalty and the national interest. It's an unresolvable tension. And time for others to take on my roles as MP and Minister. A ministerial resignation, albeit from the very end of the cabinet table, only 2 months into a new premiership, is bad enough. But when it's your brother, it's a uniquely harsh judgment. Boris Johnson himself was in Wakefield today, promoting election-ready promises like more police spending, but still without the election he wants.
Message from the Commons that they've passed the European Union withdrawal number 6.
1:30 this morning, the House of Lords finally agreed to debate the bill forcing the Prime Minister to ask for a Brexit delay if there's no Brexit deal. But opposition parties are now saying it's not enough to handcuff the Prime Minister with this bill. They need to have seen the delay happen. Only then can an election happen. Speaking in front of a row of police recruits, Boris Johnson mocked opposition resistance to an early election and the bill itself.
Can you make a promise today to the British public that you will not go back to Brussels and ask for another delay to Brexit?
Yes.
And
I can.
And would you
I'd rather be dead in a ditch.
Aren't people entitled to ask, if your own brother can't back you, why should anyone else?
Joe doesn't agree with me about the European Union because it's an issue that obviously divides families and divides everybody. But I think what Joe would agree is that we need to get on and sort this thing out.
After standing outside for 1 hour, one of the police officers arranged behind him began to feel faint. The Prime Minister was told to wind up, but carried on.
Of a vote, and time and time again, Jeremy Corbyn, don't worry, I'm going to end very soon.
Not soon enough, as the police officer began to feel unwell.
You're right.
campaign in, if he gets to have it.
Good morning, Mr. Cummings.
Dominic Cummings, his senior aide, has told friends he thinks the Tories can gain seats in unfamiliar Labour territory,
Trust the people.
but must accept the seats where the Lib Dems are in close contention. Another defection to the Lib Dems today, former Labour MP Luciana Berger, joining former Tory Philip Lee, who defected on Tuesday. Anne Milton believes a Tory hard line on Brexit could lose the party seats like Guildford. She was deselected as a Tory on Wednesday. Dominic Cummings thinks he's got in Boris Johnson an extraordinary asset that can reach bits of the country, as he did in London, that other Tories can't reach, and might just pull in working class votes in the north, other seats, to compensate for the fact that your seat probably gets lost.
Well, that remains to be seen. I think in some of those seats, Labour voters are quite tribal. I also think that in a general election, people will go, if we had one now, which I think, as I say, is a bad idea, people will go for the strong brands. And if the Brexit Party is standing, then the Brexit Party will pick up those votes.
We asked Andrew Cooper about the emerging Tory election plan and his election strategist to David Cameron and to the Remain campaign. He was suspended from the Tories back in May for backing the Lib Dems.
I would expect them to lose 25 to 30 net to the SNP in Scotland and to the Liberal Democrats in the southwest and the south of England.
So places like Aberdeen, places like Lewis to the Lib Dems down here, and you think they probably factored that in?
I think they would have factored that in, but that means that they're starting 40, 45, maybe 50 short of a majority. In order to get a majority, a working majority at all, they're saying that they're going to need to gain probably 70. To get into the territory majority of 50, they're talking about gaining potentially 100.
So they think that...
Which has been done only once since the 1930s.
Dominic Cummings thinks in Boris Johnson he's got this extraordinary asset, a lead as big as Margaret Thatcher's over Michael Foot in '83, who can transform this electoral map. That and a focus on the public sector and putting money into the NHS, into schools and the rest of it, will change the dynamic and make those seats like Bolsover winnable.
Boris Johnson is the first Prime Minister, I think, ever to start off as Prime Minister with a negative net opinion poll rating. He has a lot of baggage, he's a very divisive figure, and I think there'll be a lot of culturally Labour people in some of those seats they're targeting who will struggle with the idea that this Etonian Conservative is the embodiment of the aspirations and hopes of people like them.
Seats in the Midlands, like somewhere like Wolverhampton South West, Tories think they just need the Lib Dems to creep up a little bit in a Labcon marginal like that, and that will let the Tories get the seat back. They could be onto something there.
They could be on something in some of those seats, but if the Brexit Party stood against them too in that seat and they're losing votes to the Brexit Party because some of those very pro-Brexit people think that it all still sounds too mealy-mouthed and he's talking of a deal but he can't explain what the deal is. Or
what's he got to squeeze the Brexit Party down to?
Certainly if the Brexit Party is in double digits in percentage terms, you would start to think it's going to be very difficult for the Conservatives. But it's about where they stand.
At Downing Street this morning, a sympathetic word from US Vice President Pence.
At a very busy time here in the United Kingdom.
Always busy.
I'm grateful for your hospitality.
Always busy, the Prime Minister said, downplaying a political crisis that right now has no clear end in sight.
Well, Boris Johnson's own words of wisdom have come back to haunt him again. In 2013, after Ed Miliband beat his brother David to the Labour leadership, he told the Telegraph newspaper that, and I quote, "Only a socialist could regard familial ties as being so trivial as to shaft his own brother." Well, now his own brother Joe has turned his back on him and his government. Minnie Stevenson has been to the safe Tory seat of Orpington to see what voters there make of the decision of their MP, Joe Johnson.
As they say, blood is thicker than water, but it seems Brexit has come between these two brothers. Today, Joe Johnson said he'd been torn between family as the MP for Orpington, where, like Boris and Joe Johnson, Wayne and Gary also mix family with business, running this local funeral parlour. Raised as brothers, they too haven't always seen eye to eye politically. Gary voted to remain, Wayne to leave.
We're chalk and cheese, very different. I'm a Remainer, he's a Leaver. And I think, I'm more better the devil, Wayne's like, no, let's just get out, and, we're different, we're very different, but at the same time, we try very much to run a very tight ship here.
Is it the brotherly thing to do you think? To walk away?
On a brother level, it's difficult, it's politics, but on a brother level, I guess not, but at the same time, he is an MP and he has to, I guess, put the public first. He wants to be a public servant and I respect him for that.
Wayne, what about you? I can see you thinking about your answer in the background there. Would you walk out on Gary?
Definitely not. Family's family. Blood's thicker than water.
Come out of the EU on October the 31st. No ifs or buts.
As Boris Johnson's do-or-die Brexit message has intensified, so too have the family arguments around the Johnson dinner table, it seems. Or as their sister Rachel Johnson put it, it's becoming ISIS-like in its intensity and silliness. But can British politics rise up from the ashes, or is it all doom and gloom, I asked the Undertakers, who met the Prime Minister recently to discuss funeral aftercare.
In general, I've lost faith in Parliament. It's one of the biggest, most embarrassing things I've witnessed on telly for a long time. And I think as a country we're great, and we should be united, and I think it's our Parliament that are holding us back.
Meanwhile, there was no sign of Joe Johnson in his constituency office today, having spent nearly a decade as the MP in Orpington. The word from the Conservative Party there.
In a way, he's flip-flopped a bit because he resigned from Theresa May's government. He then told us, yes, he was supporting his brother, and now he's changed his mind over that.
So how has the news of Boris Johnson's brother standing down in this Conservative safe seat gone down?
Gutted, really gutted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a top man. He really is.
Do you know him personally?
No, but I was going to join the Conservative Club a few weeks back. Didn't get round to it, and now this has happened. I think twice about it.
Feels like it's a joke. Honestly, it's a joke. I could run the country better. And
do away with the lot.
Really?
Yes.
You're frustrated with British politics, are you?
Frustrated? God.
Tell me, I want to know your thoughts.
They're all stabbing each other in the back, and it's the local people of England who are suffering.
Frustration on the streets of Orpington, it seems, while Wayne and Gary's mantra, our family caring for your family. But in the end, the business of Brexit was politically to be the final nail in the coffin for the Johnson brothers.
Well, earlier I spoke to Ken Clarke, still theoretically the father of the House and one of the 21 rebel Tory MPs who've been kicked out of their party. I began by asking him if he had any sympathy for the Johnson brothers.
Well, I was about to say it's very sad. For me, it's just a straightforward question of political principle. At my stage in my career, I think I have very strong views on what the national interest is. I think Joe probably shares my views, political views, but for him, a terrible, terrible problem, struggling with this conflict, because it's a close family, the Johnson family. The male ones, I know all of them very well, and they've never agreed on politics on Europe, but they are a closely knit family. So Joe's, I think, had a terrible decision to make, and if we're not careful, we've just lost another outstandingly good minister and very good member of Parliament.
For Boris Johnson's brother to leave like this, how important is that?
Well, I think most normal Conservatives, people who've been involved a long time, like me, are finding the whole thing somewhat surreal and extraordinary. And I'm not surprised to discover Joe Johnson doesn't agree with his brother and the way he's handling things, because I think the majority of Conservative MPs don't agree. If there'd been a free vote in the last couple of days, most Conservative MPs in the House of Commons would have voted with the 21 who've been expelled.
It must have been very hard for Joe Johnson to resign. He's the brother, after all, of the Prime Minister. But he has exactly the same principles, as far as we know, as Amber Rudd or Nicky Morgan, for instance. Shouldn't they now be resigning as well?
Well, I think the ones who are still in government, there's quite a lot of members of the Cabinet who agree with the ones who've been thrown out. And I think they are an influence that's restraining what's going on, or trying to. And some of them still appear to believe that Boris might somehow get a deal. That I cannot for the life of me think how they think that's going to happen when he has no proposals to make at all and hasn't even set up a proper negotiating team.
There's a reason why the Tory party has been in power, you know, a dominant presence in British politics for so long. And one of them, perhaps, is that it's able to kind of move with the times and, you know, stick to its principles but move with the times. Couldn't you argue that this is just another one of those, albeit quite dramatic moments, that the Tory party is merely adapting to the, you know, to the socio-economic changes of Britain?
In that case, you get me worrying about where democratic politics is going. In my more gloomy moments, I think this is the equivalent to Trump winning in America and sweeping aside all the mainstream politicians there, to Salvini, who nearly rose to power in Italy and still could, and so on. It's alternative for Deutschland.
That moment? I mean, surely we are there as well, aren't we?
Well, except we're having a slightly crazier version even than Trump in America, I think. And we are meant to have the most stable, long-term parliamentary democracy in the world. We have the mother of parliaments. People admire our political institutions, or at least they did until about 6 months ago. And we just have to see if not only the political establishment, but the public start demanding some serious government, stop treating it as a game, realise in the modern world difficult decisions have to be taken. If we are insisting on leaving the European Union, do so in an orderly fashion.
Did Dominic Cummings come between the Johnson brothers? Is he now running number 10?
I've never met Dominic Cummings. I have never exchanged a word with him. Not particularly, I don't think, but I just follow. I mean, the very wide, almost universally held theory in the Palace of Westminster by ministers and backbenchers, this chap Cummings is really running the government. He might turn out to be a very nice chap, for all I know, but everybody seems to think that he's, firstly, never belonged to the Conservative Party, and secondly, he has this amazingly belligerent approach and doesn't quite understand Parliament and the rule of law and all these things.
But he might still win. If there is indeed an election, whenever, Boris Johnson might well win that election, and then suddenly Boris Johnson's tactics and Dominic Cummings' inspiration would be seen to have won the day.
Well, in this election, anything's possible. I mean, you haven't asked me, fortunately, to forecast too much, because no one can forecast what's going to happen next week. Day by day, bizarre events are happening. I have no idea who would win an election. Very probable, I think, it will produce another hung Parliament.
Are you still available as caretaker Prime Minister, by the way?
That is a really entertaining footnote, which broke out about a week ago. As I keep saying, people should concentrate on the serious issues of the day.
You're not waiting by the phone?
No, I'm not waiting by the phone, no. It does make me smile, because I remember, you know, times gone by, there were times when, slightly more seriously, I was occasionally floated as the next Prime Minister, but two. But now I'm an elder statesman, and I just wish to see this country properly governed in a way that looks after the interests of my children and grandchildren.
Ken Clark, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, I'm joined now by the journalist Hugo Dixon, who is an old school friend of Boris Johnson, and he's known Joe Johnson also for many years. He's now the deputy chair of the People's Vote campaign. Fraser Nelson is editor of The Spectator magazine, a position Boris Johnson once occupied, and Sonia Purnell, who wrote Mr. Johnson's biography, Just Boris, a tale of blonde ambition. Used to work with him at the Daily Telegraph's bureau in Brussels too. Well, let's just talk first of all about how close this family is. I mean, you were at prep school, public school, FT, everything else. I mean, are they a clan?
Yes, they are. They are. They are a family, and there's a huge amount of love within the family. It's a tight family. Even though they, obviously disagree. I mean, as we know, Rachel Johnson actually stood for a completely different party in the European elections. And Joe has had a completely different view from Boris about Brexit, but actually went into his cabinet, albeit not as a voting member, but attending the cabinet. I think unfortunately it was a mistake, but he has done something very courageous and wise today, which is to resign.
Well, I'll come to that in just a moment. I just want to tie up this business. I mean, do you think that this relationship has continued throughout their adult lives as well? I mean, would they be close now?
I mean, I think they probably are close. They've always been uber competitive. It's always. I remember hearing that when Joe got his first from Oxford, compared with Boris's 2-1, Rachel had the terrible job of breaking the terrible news to Boris. I mean, hugely competitive. But like you say, great love. But this will have really hurt. There will, I'm sure, have been anger on both sides. This will really have hurt Boris. I think it will have shaken him quite a lot.
But Fraser Nelson, that's what makes this so curious. Why on earth did a Remainer, a man who wants a second referendum, why on earth did he go into his brother's cabinet? Just brotherly love?
Well, he might have worked out that Brexit might soon be over and the work of reconciliation can be gotten. That will need the people like Joe Johnson and other Remainers who are willing to work with half of the country who wanted Brexit to try to make things better. Now, that might have been his initial thoughts, but then by the time these 21 Tories were being given the axe, I think he might be able to smell a new Tory manifesto coming down the track that he would have to sign, saying he was signed up to this Brexit policy and that Brexit policy. And if he thought his heart really wasn't in it and he really couldn't sign something he didn't believe to be true, it does make sense to leave politics as he's assigned to.
But does it actually matter? I mean, what do you think this says to the public? Hugo?
I'm not sure how much it says to the public. I mean, but I do think
if
it
his
really.
own
But I
brother
do think.
doesn't.
Well, I do. Yes, of course, there is a question. If his own brother doesn't believe it, then how could anyone else believe it? But I actually think the more significant impact is on Boris himself, because, as we said, I mean, this family loves each other, and this is, in a way, as I wrote today, the most unkindest cut of all. And coming from someone who is so close. Now, I think that Joe was very brave to do what he did, but it will have been a real blow to Boris, particularly as we also know, and I hate to say this, but he was never a true believer in Brexit to start off with. And so he doesn't have the sort of courage of his convictions on this very deep subject that is tearing the nation apart, and his own brother says, well, I'm sorry, but I can't back you either. And we saw it today in front of that police academy. It was, unfortunately, a rather rambling speech. You don't feel that Boris is actually in control of things anymore.
Sonia Pennell, I saw you nodding your head very fervently there.
Well, I mean, I'm quite worried in the sense of, the stability in Boris's life is largely gone. When his marriage to Marina was still functioning, she provided this great rock for him, kind of, softened the edges a little bit. He now doesn't have that. We don't even know how many children he has. We don't know what his sort of private arrangements are, though they do seem to be chaotic. He is a prime minister in the midst of a massive national crisis. You do need him to have an absolutely rock-solid background. We know now that the family at large is divided. His home life is chaotic. This is not good for someone who's having to face the challenges that he is. And I think that's why we're seeing rambling speeches. He is not focused in the way that he should be.
Well, Fraser Nelson, it's hard to disagree with that, I imagine. And we have a situation in which Dominic Cummings is coming under unbelievable pressure for the sort of cack-handedness of his operation.
It's true that the parliamentary manoeuvres of the last few days have ended in failure. Parliament's indecision is final. That's what we found out. They tried every trick in the book to get a parliamentary resolution to Brexit. Now that's not working. They're going for a general election. Of course, huge disappointment because nobody really wanted this election. But given that Parliament won't either back a deal and it won't back no deal, there's no other way around it. So yes, a lot of people are being thrown on the campaign trail far earlier than they expected, without the preparation they would have expected. But the Parliament can't decide, and the public will have to in a general election. That is our basic democracy.
Do you agree with this analysis that seemed to be present here, which is that he is desperate for support, for props, for sustaining? He has made very poor speeches so far, another one this afternoon in Wakefield. I mean, where's his performance going to come from?
I'm not sure that Jeremy Corbyn's been making fairly poor speeches for quite a while. And I mean, the thing is that politicians make bad speeches without us having to psychoanalyze them or working out what their personal life is like. I mean, they can make bad ones, they can make good ones. It doesn't matter if they've got a strong family or if their life is falling apart. Boris should be making good speeches. Of course he should. He's capable of making brilliant ones. And every time he gives one which falls flat, we think, my God, what happened to Boris the great orator? So he's judged against a pretty high standard, a standard he's going to have to get better at meeting. But let's face it, he's been doing other things in these last couple of weeks than sitting in his office writing speeches.
Hugo?
Well, I'm not convinced that he's going to get the election the way that Fraser says. I think he's quite likely to have to wait until he asks for an extension. He said today that he would die in a ditch rather than ask for an extension. But
he's got a lot of dying to do. I mean, do or die. dying in the ditch. But where next?
Well, I know, and this is the problem, is that if he doesn't really have conviction behind this Brexit policy, every day that goes by where he is left to stew in his own juice, which is the phrase that the Labour Party is using, I think will make him more and more uncomfortable. And it's quite possible we'll see other resignations. It's quite possible we know that there are at least 100 Tory MPs who are unhappy with those expulsions from the Conservative Party, the Purge. And so I think and we also think that he wasn't very happy with them either. And so, I mean, he's in a terrible situation. And I wrote today that he really only has three choices if Labour actually doesn't give him that election. He has one choice, is to break the law, which I think would be terrible. The other is to do what the law tells him to do, which would mean dying in a ditch. And the third would be to resign and fall on his sword.
Fraser Nelson, is it that bad? Can he recover? I mean, he doesn't look like a man who's in recovery at the moment.
Well, if you look at the opinion polls, you'll find, 35% of the country back the Conservatives, 12% back the Brexit Party, almost half of this country backing either the Tories or the Brexit Party. Put it this way, the Tories have been in worse positions than this, and recovery, when you've got so much public support, is not unthinkable.
Well, you studied him, Sonia. I mean, can he recover? Does he have that sort of personal resilience, or is he dependent on other people to push him up?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, he is a political Houdini. He has recovered from many previous catastrophes. However, what he doesn't have now, he always had before to buoy him up, was public adulation. You can hear people here shouting at Boris as a liar. He's never had that before. He won't like that. That will make him feel uncomfortable. It's going to be a lot harder this time, maybe not even possible.
Sonia Purnell, Fraser Nelson, Hugo Dixon, thank you all three very much. That's it for the moment from me here. Let's go over to Matt Fry in Downing Street. Matt.
Thanks, John. Well, as we've heard, Boris Johnson was at an event today in Yorkshire where, if he had got the required two-thirds majority of MPs last night to trigger a general election, he would have been launching his campaign. Our political correspondent, Paul McNamara, is there for us now. Paul.
Yes, I think it's fair to say in many ways this wasn't quite how the trip turned out, how the Prime Minister would have wanted. Firstly, it's not day one of an election campaign. Secondly, as Gary said in his report earlier on, one of the police officers almost fainted behind the Prime Minister after being left waiting out in the sunshine for a very long time for a delayed Prime Minister. And then there was the welcome he received when he arrived at this very spot just a few hours ago. So Mr Johnson was here to launch his national campaign to recruit 20,000 police officers over the next 3 years. Well, that was the official reason for being here. Unofficially, though, it felt very much like a Prime Minister in electioneering mode. At one point he said, quote, "I hate banging on about Brexit," and then spent quite a long time, well, banging on about Brexit. All of this, of course, has drawn some criticism. Firstly, from the West Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner. I spoke to him earlier on. He said the Prime Minister should not be using a backdrop of police officers to be making political points. That was reiterated by Labour MPs. Labour MPs like Mary Cray just up the road in Wakefield. And here's where we get back to the electioneering. Why is the Prime Minister here? Labour have held Mary Cray's seat since 1932, but her majority is only 2,000, and 66% of people voted for Brexit around here. So if Mr Johnson does get his election, an election forced on Brexit, it's seats like this that he will have his eyes on. Just how likely are voters to vote for him? Well, the views are mixed.
What is it about him that appeals to me? He's a different politician. I think the politicians have let us down terribly.
I don't think he can do it. I don't at all. I think he's lying. He says that he has a plan, but he hasn't said what it is.
That's what I want him to do, get us out. Should have been out 3.5 years ago. Should have been buggering about like we are now.
I don't trust him. I think everything's, like I say, there's like a facade about him. He puts out this front, this face, this stupid, silly attitude thing, his shirt hanging out, walking down the street talking to himself and silly hair.
Donald Trump.
Yeah, it basically is. Britain's Donald Trump.
Well, here in London, the High Court has been hearing from lawyers who are challenging the 5-week suspension of Parliament. The case was brought by businesswoman Gina Miller, who successfully challenged the government over the triggering of Article 50. And she was backed today by former Tory Prime Minister John Major. Fatima Manji was in court. Fatima, what happened?
Well, Matt, 3 High Court judges presided over this case, brought about by, as you say, Gina Miller, and backed by Sir John Major. That in itself is astonishing. When was the last time we saw a former Conservative Prime Minister take a current Conservative Prime Minister to court? Others involved in this case are Shami Chakrabarti, the Shadow Attorney General, and the Welsh and Scottish Government. Now, we heard extraordinary arguments, including legal principles from the 17th century. But very simply, Gina Miller's legal team argue that Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament is an abuse of power. They cite media interviews saying that Boris Johnson has implied that Parliament is a nuisance and a threat to his Brexit plan, and that's the motivation for proroguing Parliament. They also referred to a handwritten note by Boris Johnson, which we can show you for the first time today. I think we've got that up now, in which you can see Boris Johnson says, writes here in his handwriting, the September session of Parliament is a rigmarole introduced to show the public that MPs were earning their crust. So I don't see anything shocking about this prorogation. Now, the government's lawyers argue that all of this is not a matter for the courts, it's not a legal principle, it's a political principle.
Now, we had a similar case in Scotland yesterday, in Edinburgh, and it didn't succeed. So what's going to happen here, do you think?
That's right. So the Court of Session in Edinburgh heard a case brought about by the SNP MP Joanna Cherry and others. That was unsuccessful, though they're appealing. As part of that case, we've seen the release of government documents, which include cabinet meetings and a memo to the Prime Minister. Crucially, they show us that they were discussing suspension back in August, and the timing on that is very important. As for this case, brought about by Gina Miller in the High Court in London, we should hear a judgment at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Very difficult to say which way it's going to go. It's a very fine point of principle, parliamentary sovereignty. Who's the safeguard of that? Is it the courts or is it political? One more complication. We think that whichever side loses tomorrow is likely to take this case to the Supreme Court. So we're going to see all kinds of constitutional arguments bashed out again just around the corner from here.
Watch this space. Fatima, thanks very much. We're going to bounce it back to John on College Green. John.
So Boris Johnson wants an election. Why don't his political opponents want one? Here to discuss that are Jane Dodds, leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats and elected only last month as the MP for Brecon and Radnorshire, and Drew Hendry from the Scottish National Party. Let's ask you first, in your very new position, not as leader of the Liberal Democrats in Wales, but as an MP, what are the terms under which you Liberal Democrats would accept an election?
The terms would be really clear, and that is that no deal Brexit is taken off the table. We want to make sure that that happens before we go into any general election period. And it's really great that the parties in Parliament that are opposing Conservatives have been working together on this.
Well, you've got a man who said do or die, and he's not going to grant an extension and go for an extension. What do you do in those circumstances?
Well, let's just see. We've got the opportunity to say we don't want a general election, and we'll see if that goes through. We've got another opportunity on Monday to debate it, but we're really clear: no general election until we've got Brexit off the no deal Brexit off the table.
And for the SNP?
Well, we can't allow Boris Johnson to game the system here. He's looking to try and force through a no-deal Brexit. We know that. It's very, very clear. So the timing of an election shouldn't be up to a Prime Minister who has no mandate, wasn't elected by the people, wasn't elected by Parliament, and clearly has no majority. In fact, it's even got worse over the past few days, no majority in Parliament. So we can't allow him to do that way. We really want an election as quickly as possible. We're desperate to get out and start that campaign to kick the Tories out of power. Scotland is looking on in horror at this at the moment, but we won't sacrifice a no-deal Brexit being pushed through as a consequence.
So, Jane Dodds, in the event, improbable though it feels at the moment, that he says, right, I do accept an extension, those are the circumstances under which you would then agree to the date of an election?
Yeah, Drew, as Drew says, it's not that we're scared of a general election. Don't forget, we've just had 2 MPs join us this week. The Liberal Democrats are in a good place, and we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to beat the Conservatives as well. But we're putting that above everything else to make sure we stop a no-deal Brexit.
Now, you wouldn't normally probably be chatting privately to the Labour Party in any kind of a joyful way, but have you agreed things behind the scenes? I mean, is there a degree of unity, or are you just saying, here's the Liberal Democrat position, or here's the SNP position?
We've always been prepared to work across the benches for progressive reasons. So it's nothing new to us to be talking to the other opposition parties at the moment, and talks are ongoing. What we want to do is make sure that we can't have the calamity of a no-deal Brexit and all the economic and social chaos that would bring in its wake. And we're not going to allow Boris Johnson to game the system like this. As I said, what we want to do is get to an election as quickly as possible, but it's vitally important that he isn't able to use any kind of system here to undermine Parliament any further than they already has done.
How will the SNP vote on Monday?
Well, we'll be voting to make sure that on the 31st of October we don't go out with a no-deal Brexit. Look, we're exploring different ways to say how can we get...
So you'd have to vote against an election?
If that is necessary, then yes, that would be the case.
And do you sense Labour will come with you?
Well, I'm not party to those talks that might be going on just now. We're talking as a group with the other groups in the House of Commons. As I said, whatever happens, on Monday, whether there's a possibility to do something with a guarantee, with some kind of ability to guarantee there is no chance, absolutely no chance of leaving on a no-deal Brexit, then we can look at that. But at the moment, it doesn't look like that's likely.
Well, now, I mean, it's a bizarre situation that you're propping up a government you oppose and who wants to leave Europe. And you're absolutely opposed to them in every dimension.
Well, the Liberal Democrats are really, really clear. We've always been the Remain party. We've always been the party that says we need a people's vote. And we are the party now working very clearly with the other parties saying, take no deal Brexit off the table, and then we'll look at a general election.
So the short-term support for a government you hate is something you just have to bear?
Well, it is something that we're putting politics above everything, and we're saying this is going to be desperately catastrophic for the lives of people, farmers, people working in agriculture. It's going to make poorer people poor, and we're not prepared to put up with that.
But you can feel the frustration in the country. People are just fed up to the teeth. I mean, they're now, of course, rolling about wondering what on earth's going on, but they're fed up to the back teeth with this whole thing. Why not just let them get on and...
Well, whether you voted Leave or Remain, I don't think anybody can be happy with the way this Boris Johnson government is going forward, or indeed with Theresa May's lost years in terms of dealing with this issue. There have been plenty of opportunities to engage across the Parliament, and that has never been done by this Tory government under the previous Prime Minister or under this one. So I'm not surprised that people are unhappy, but this has been a construct of the Tory government over the past few years.
Are you convinced tonight that you will get this through and that you will get the election at the date that you want?
Well, Boris Johnson has no majority in Parliament. They've either thrown overboard the moderate Tories or they've kicked them out, or they've left, I should say, over the past few days. It's made his situation even less tenable. So he's a Prime Minister without any backup in Parliament and no government but in name only. So, I believe that, yes, there will be a majority to see this through to the 31st of October and make sure that we don't go out in a no-deal Brexit.
Drew Hendry, Shane Dodds, thank you both very warmly.
Thank you.